What's a simple thing we could do to make room for intimate friendship?
Bobby and I actually had a conversation this week about this idea of what are rules for? I think sometimes we know that we need guardrails in our lives, right? We know there's an edge here. If I fall over it, that's going to be a bad thing. And so sometimes our instinct is then to put up a barrier, to keep ourselves far away from that. The problem is sometimes we need, like Bobby was talking about that tonight, is that risk to move towards things that we know can be a little bit scary. The problem is when we pull all the rules away and we say, hey, there's no boundaries, there's no barriers in our lives, then we end up falling in the ditches sometimes. So I think what we have to try to manage is to think about a culture, to think about a community that is less driven by hard, legalistic rules, do this, don't do that, and is instead more thoughtful and wise about what are my intentions, what am I moving toward, is that good for me in this moment right now, or is it something that I need to back away from? Now, how do you do that in practice? That gets really difficult. But I think the first step is that we start to expect from each other the ability to make mistakes. We start to expect from each other the ability to ask questions of each other. Hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm feeling. What's your feedback that you have for me on this? I'm heading in this direction. What are your thoughts about that? I think all the way back to the Samson story in the first week. I think a big part of the problem in his story is he doesn't have anyone to say, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm frustrated about, this is what I'm mad about. And somebody to say to him, that's okay, you get to feel all those things, but you're chasing them down scary, dark paths that are going to lead you off the edge into that ditch you want to avoid. Just the rule that tells Samson, don't be mad, don't be angry, don't think this, don't think that. All that's going to do is drive him even farther into himself. And so it's this really tricky balance. And I think it comes down to vulnerability and it comes down to openness. That we have to have the space to say the outlandish thing that we're wrestling with to somebody else. And trust them to say, it's okay that you feel that. It's okay that you're thinking that. But let me push back on that from my perspective. And I think if we can do that for each other, I think we can actually move in more mature, healthy ways. But again, this is the risk of doing community and doing friendship without rules, is there is no, and if you do this, it's going to be a safe way to do it. That's the hard part. And I think that's why communities, that's why relationships do default to, well, just don't cross this line and everything will be fine. It'll be fine in the sense of you won't fall in the ditch, but it won't be fine in the sense of you get to fully express yourself. So I think the whole point tonight was, if you're going to do it well, it's going to come with vulnerability, and it's going to come with some risks, and sometimes you're going to mess it up.
Yeah, I love this question. I have just like a simple answer, I think, but I think the simplicity maybe betrays it, is that like we have to know each other's stories. I really think that is profound work, to like have enough hospitality in our souls for one another's stories. I don't know why I tell you guys these stories at the 7 p.m., but when I was working on my dating life, I remember really struggling with the rules that were put on Christians in particular. And I was a woman in my like mid-30s, and I was like, wait, like, I'm not sure that this rule book is that helpful for me at this point in my life. But you know what was really helpful for me was having honest conversations with really good friends who could hear me in my anger, my frustration, my curiosity, without judgment, and work on some kind of discernment. But it took them really knowing my story. So I think there's something about that. What does that really look like when kind of the infrastructure of the place is like we're here with one another for an hour, maybe 3 times a month? Like, what does that look like to really know one another's stories, to hold them in our souls, and to wonder about discernment, judgment, careful living, careful loving relationships, an expansion of that, not a reduction of that. So I think it's something about us really paying attention to one another's stories and being ready for those to look quite different than maybe the ones that we expect to hear from people.
What would you say, where's the line between intimacy and oversharing?
Oh, this one is back. I like it.
I think with a lot of these questions, just like this first one, there is no, this is the line. This is where you've gone too far. This is where you haven't gone far enough. I think the question comes down to, can you ask yourself, so often when I think about even dating relationships or romantic relationships, I often think there's an ethic of self. Who am I? What am I willing to make vulnerable about myself in this relationship? Who is my partner? What do I know about them? What do I know about their mental space and their health right now? What are they willing or able to receive from me and give back to me? There's also the ethic of the relationship that's between you. So maybe you're in a good, healthy space, your partner's in a good, healthy space, but this relationship is new. It hasn't matured. It hasn't had the time to marinate and grow into its own thing. All of that has to be factored into how we think about relationships. Well, when it comes to this question of being vulnerable and oversharing, I think all of that comes into it as well. What are you comfortable sharing about who you are? That's a good question to ask. Who's this person you're talking to? Where are they coming from? What's going on in their life? Do you even know that right now? And if you do they have a lot of pressures that they're under right now? Maybe it's not appropriate for you to dump on them in this moment. But then also, what's this relationship that exists between you and that person? Did you just meet them? Do you know who they are? Has that relationship formed enough bonds where if you share something that's a little bit outlandish and a little bit scary, it's going to have the durability to move through that in a healthy way? Now, the tough thing is, can you calculate and do the calculus on all three of those different types of things every time you just need to get something off your chest? No. And I'm not saying we're going to do that every time, but I do think we should be thoughtful enough around all of those questions. Who am I? What do I need to share? What do I need to hold for myself? Who's this person? What are they dealing with right now? And what am I sharing with them? And then how well do I know them? And how has this relationship grown over time? And if it has grown, and it does have history, then there's going to be a lot more like elasticity where if it gets stretched and you share something that makes them uncomfortable, they're going to say, but I know you, I love you, I can move back in toward you. So again, is it possible to do that every time? No, of course not. But I think those are the types of things that I wrestle with when I think about this. And last thing, I think about this as a pastor all the time, because Bobby and I are sharing stories about our lives right now. I'm very comfortable sharing a lot of stories. There are a lot of stories in my life that are just for me. Mm-hmm. They're just for me and my wife, Rachel. They're just me and my son. My son's 11 years old now. Every time I tell a story about him now, I'm asking him, is that okay? When he was 6, I just did tell funny stories and it was fine. He's 11 now, right? Like I want to ask him, is it okay if I tell this story, buddy? Right? That's a wise and a healthy thing, is for you to decide what stories are for you, what stories are for this friendship, what stories are for this friendship, and how are you going to dole those out in appropriate ways.
Yeah, I like that commitment of, generally not telling other people's stories. I think that's a really careful thing to honor. But I will say about oversharing, I think that there's opportunity for us to really either see ourselves and what we need, or see others and what they need, and maybe be a part of their process of getting their needs met. So I kind of have this visual, like, we sometimes think about maybe our emotions and they're quite close to us, but I wonder if we could think about oversharing like that too. Like it's something that's going on in us and we're like working it out. But if we start to notice, man, I keep talking about the same thing, or I keep walking away from conversations being like, oh, I totally overshared. Stop yourself in that moment and take this thing and just hold it out a little farther and try to take a look at, like, what am I working out, and who might be able, or what resource might I find to help myself get through what I need. So I think that there's opportunity. I think that something is crying out to us to get worked out. I think it's such a beautiful way that we are made, or that we evolved, that we're working stuff out all the time, and we should have a lot of grace for ourselves in that, and a lot of grace for one another in that. So that's my invitation to you. Find a way to just hold it maybe in the space between you and consider, like, what am I being called to in my healing and my wholeness?
And one last thing about this whole series, I mean, this series is really about intimacy and about the fact that most of us need to share more in our lives. Sure, there's probably moments where we've all overshared, and there's probably moments where people have dumped on us in that way. But I think as a whole, right, these last 3 conversations are about, hey, how do we push ourselves to be more intimate, more vulnerable, and share a little bit more of our stories? So, yeah, obviously, everybody hold that tension and think about that balance in your lives. But on the whole,
That's good.
we probably need to do a little more, not less. So.